It started on a Tuesday morning, the kind where the city feels heavy but strangely familiar. Emma had just brewed her coffee, the smell thick and comforting, and settled into her small apartment's worn armchair. She pulled out her phone, scrolling almost absent-mindedly through notifications, when an alert from her bank popped up. Another subscription payment had gone through, $14.99. Streaming service, she murmured, then another, $9.99, a meditation app, and then $6.99. A recipe box she had signed up for 3 months ago. Each was small, almost laughable. Yet, seeing them lined up like soldiers marching off her bank balance, a strange knot formed in her stomach. She didn't feel deprived. She loved her life, the little comforts she could afford. But somehow, this quiet trickle of money leaving her account made her uneasy. Emma knew the total amount wasn't catastrophic, maybe $150 a month. But she also knew something subtle was happening, something almost invisible. Over a year compounded, that $150 became nearly $2,000. $2,000 she hadn't actively planned to spend. Her friend Marcus once said, "The problem with habits is not when you notice them, but when you don't." And Emma realized this was exactly that. Not the big impulsive purchases that made your stomach drop. Not the flashy items you debated for days. It was the quiet, invisible ones, the subscriptions, the just this once small payments, the little conveniences she didn't even think about. The day at work didn't help. At her desk in the co-working space downtown, she watched her colleagues scroll through apps, buying small digital items, donating to causes, or signing up for trials. Some of them would delete the apps after a week, some would forget entirely. Emma found herself noticing patterns. The mental cost was low because the physical act of spending felt almost effortless. Swiping, tapping, and done. No cash changed hands, no pain. It reminded her of a story she had read about behavioral economics, about a psychologist named Richard Thaler who had described the pain of paying. The more detached we are from our money, the less we feel that pain, and the more likely we are to spend. Emma realized she had created a buffer between herself and her money. She didn't swipe cash. She didn't see each transaction leave her wallet. Everything was automated, convenient, hidden. And that convenience had a cost she hadn't fully acknowledged. On her lunch break, she wandered through a bookstore, trying to clear her mind. A small, dusty ledger caught her eye. It wasn't the kind with colorful designs, but one of those simple, unassuming books that seemed like it could hold secrets. Emma bought it on a whim. That night, instead of scrolling through her phone, she began writing down every single small transaction she had made that month. Every $2.99 app upgrade. Every $5 lunch she had bought just because it was convenient. Every tiny recurring subscription. By the time she finished, the total made her catch her breath. $378. That was just in 1 month. And it wasn't like she had spent it frivolously, at least not in the classic sense. She had spent it for comfort, for efficiency, for the quiet enjoyment of life's small conveniences. But the sum, the cumulative effect, made her question how she had let these habits form without notice. It wasn't just the money. It was the psychology behind it. Emma began to notice how her mind justified the small spends. It's only $5. It's my treat. It makes life easier. Each statement was true in isolation, but in combination they formed a narrative that slowly, invisibly drained her bank account. It was like water slipping through a tiny hole in a bucket. You might not see the damage until the bucket is almost empty. Then came the realization. This wasn't just about discipline or self-control. It was about awareness. Emma had to confront the quiet systems in her life that allowed small leaks to grow into meaningful losses. She started mapping her patterns, noting the triggers: boredom, convenience, social influence, habit. She realized she often spent when her emotions were slightly negative. Not sadness exactly, but a vague sense of dissatisfaction. Every time she felt restless in the evening, she would scroll apps, clicking through small transactions, each one a tiny escape from discomfort. One night, as she traced her purchases back through the ledger, Emma found an unsettling symmetry. The times she had spent the most coincided almost perfectly with the days she felt the least in control. It was as if money had become a subtle barometer for her emotional state, a hidden map of when she let herself relax vigilance. That insight made her feel both powerful and exposed. Powerful because recognizing the pattern meant she could change it. Exposed because it revealed how much she had let invisible habits dictate her financial reality. But the most surprising revelation came from doing the math. If she kept the habit of letting small subscriptions and conveniences run unchecked in 5 years, that $378 a month, less than her weekend coffee budget, would compound to over $22,000 spent on things she barely noticed. Compound not in interest earned, but in lost opportunity. She could have invested that money, grown it, let it work silently for her instead of quietly draining her account. And the compounding wasn't only financial, it was psychological. Each month, the habit strengthened, making her more likely to continue spending mindlessly. Emma decided to experiment. She didn't want to shame herself or live austere. She simply wanted awareness. For the next month, she turned off all automatic payments. She wrote down every purchase, no matter how small, in her dusty ledger. And she started asking herself a question before every spend. Does this add long-term value, or am I just filling a moment? The answer wasn't always clear, and sometimes the purchases remained. But noticing the decision she realized was the first step toward control. By the end of that month, something strange happened. She felt calmer. Money didn't have to be a source of quiet anxiety anymore. She didn't need to remove every subscription or eliminate every convenience. She just needed to know them, to see the subtle drain, to understand it. The act of noticing transformed the way she thought about money from automatic reaction to conscious participation. One evening, Emma sat back in her chair with her coffee, looking at her ledger. The columns of numbers were neat, but the story behind them was clearer than ever. Every $6, $9, or $15 spent had a reason, a trigger, an emotional echo. Money was no longer invisible. It was telling her about herself, her habits, her comfort zones, and her blind spots. And she realized the quietest drains are often the most powerful because they teach the most about who we are. And yet, even as she felt this growing sense of mastery, a question lingered. She had noticed one type of habit, but what other quiet drains might be hiding in the shadows of her life, silently shaping her financial future without her awareness? The next morning, Emma woke up with the sun casting a soft orange glow across her apartment. She brewed her coffee, as usual, but today she did something different. She opened her laptop and pulled up her bank statements, not just to scroll, but to study them like a map. She noticed patterns she hadn't seen before. Small payments clustered around certain times, mornings before work, late nights after dinner, weekends when she was restless. Her subconscious seemed to signal these moments as spend zones, places where her brain felt entitled to small indulgences. It wasn't that she lacked self-control in a dramatic sense. She didn't have impulse buying sprees at the mall or blow her paycheck on flashy gadgets. Her spending was quiet, consistent, and almost invisible, yet cumulative and, in a way, more insidious. Behavioral economists call this the drift effect. Money leaking out slowly, unnoticed, in ways that feel reasonable at the moment. The pain of paying is muted because the transaction is small, digital, and emotionally convenient. Emma realized she had been living in a constant state of small, unnoticed financial surrender. Later that day, she met Marcus for lunch. He was animated, talking about his latest side project, while Emma fidgeted with her fork, her mind half on the conversation and half on a recurring subscription she had forgotten to cancel. She hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever track your small spending? Like, the stuff you don't even think about?" Marcus laughed, but there was a knowing edge to it. "Oh, absolutely. I used to ignore it. $3 here, $10 there. It never seems like much until you actually add it up. That's when it hits. It's like your money evaporates, but silently. I think of it like mental leakage." Emma nodded. Mental leakage. That phrasing struck her. It wasn't about poor financial literacy or laziness. It was about attention, about the mind's tendency to focus on big, dramatic events while ignoring small, repeated ones. Our brains are wired to notice extremes, not subtle, repetitive patterns. And money, being mostly abstract these days, numbers in a bank account, was particularly vulnerable to this invisibility. Back home, Emma decided to take a small experiment further. She set a rule. Any discretionary spend over $5 required a 1-minute pause. No apps, no subscriptions, no just because. Just a moment to consider. Why am I spending this? What am I getting beyond immediate satisfaction? It was almost absurdly simple, but the results surprised her. She began noticing that many of her purchases were compensations, responses to boredom, mild anxiety, or social influence, not genuine desire. She thought about the psychology behind it. Behavioral finance studies often point to hyperbolic discounting, the tendency to prioritize small, immediate rewards over larger, delayed ones. That latte, that app upgrade, that $6 audiobook, they were small, immediate gratifications. And because they were small, the future cost felt negligible. Even though compounded over months, it could reshape her financial landscape entirely. Emma realized she had been trapped in a soft version of this bias for years, tiny gratifications accumulating into silent depletion. One evening, Emma reflected on her friend Claire, who had always seemed effortlessly frugal. Claire didn't deprive herself, yet her savings steadily grew. The difference, Emma realized, wasn't in the big decisions. It was in the small, habitual ones. Claire had fewer, invisible drains. She didn't mind paying for conveniences, but she was conscious about what she allowed into her life, what habits she repeated without thought. Emma's small subscriptions, her unnoticed purchases, were essentially invisible habit chains, each link tiny, harmless, yet forming a net strong enough to trap her finances without alarm. Emma began to notice how this pattern mirrored other areas of life. Just as small, repeated spending habits could quietly drain her bank account, small, repeated emotional responses shaped her daily experience. Little compromises, ignored annoyances, tiny indulgences in distraction, they all compounded. There was a subtle symmetry between psychology and money. Both thrived on unnoticed repetition. Both required awareness to redirect. One Saturday, she sat in a quiet cafe with her ledger open. She began categorizing her small expenditures, not just by cost, but by trigger. She noticed that a disproportionate number came from moments when she felt slightly unsettled, waiting for an email response, catching herself mid-scroll on social media, or finishing a work task and not knowing what to do next. Money, in these moments, was almost a substitute for emotional regulation. Spending was soothing, and therein lay the trap. The more she leaned on spending to manage emotion, the more invisible it became. It reminded her of an article she had read about choice architecture. The environment subtly shapes decisions, often without awareness. If a subscription is easy to forget, if apps make spending feel frictionless, if a one-click purchase is normalized, then the environment quietly encourages leakage. Emma realized her financial ecosystem had been designed, inadvertently, for invisibility. The bank's convenience, the app's seamless payments, the automated renewals, all these nudges created a habit loop she hadn't consciously chosen. Her next step was subtle but powerful. She didn't cancel everything. Instead, she reshaped her environment. She moved subscriptions to a single card, visible in a spreadsheet. She set alerts for every recurring charge. She created friction for discretionary spending, requiring a note, a conscious reflection, even a small pause. And she watched. Slowly, the invisible drain became visible. Each transaction had a story, an intention, a conscious choice behind it. By the end of that month, she noticed the psychological shift. Money was no longer a passive current pulling her forward. She could see its flow, its patterns, its quiet signals about her habits, her desires, her emotional tendencies. The small purchases weren't gone, but their meaning had changed. They had become conscious, not automatic. And for the first time in years, Emma felt a subtle control she hadn't realized was missing. Yet, even as she celebrated this newfound awareness, a thought lingered like a shadow. If the quiet drain had been so easy to miss in one area of her life, how many other subtle, invisible habits were silently shaping her financial trajectory? Habits she hadn't yet noticed, habits that could compound in ways far more powerful than these small subscriptions. The following week, Emma began experimenting with a simple ritual. Before any discretionary spend, she asked herself one question: will this choice matter a year from now? Some purchases passed the test easily, a book she would read repeatedly, a cooking class she'd planned for months. But others faltered. That $4 coffee upgrade? Not meaningful. That app with a few extra features she barely used? Unnecessary. And each time she recognized the distinction, she felt a quiet sense of liberation. What surprised her most wasn't the money she saved. It was the awareness it gave her about herself. Money, she realized, is less about numbers and more about psychology. Each transaction revealed something deeper. When she craved distraction, when she sought comfort, when she wanted to impress someone, or herself. And the subtle, repeated drains weren't just financial, they were emotional, almost like tiny leaks in her attention and energy. One evening, she sat on her balcony, watching city lights flicker like fireflies. Emma thought about compounding in a different sense. Not interest, not investment, but habits. One small purchase repeated every month might seem trivial, but repeated over years, it formed a pattern that defined her financial reality. $3 here, $7 there. It didn't scream problem in the moment, but its quiet accumulation could shape her life, unconsciously dictating her capacity to invest, save, or explore opportunities. She recalled a story she had read about a man named David, who unknowingly spent hundreds on microtransactions and games over several years. Each purchase was under $5, each one rationalized as harmless. Yet when tallied, the sum rivaled the cost of a brand new car. Emma didn't want to end up like David, not because the money alone mattered, but because the underlying behavior, the invisible habit loop, had hijacked choice. The lesson was clear: the small, invisible habits were often the most powerful because they escape attention until it's too late. Marcus texted her that night, asking to meet at their favorite coffee shop. As they sat across from each other, he shared something that struck Emma. "It's funny," he said, stirring his tea. "We obsess over big expenses, rent, car payments, tuition, but we let tiny, repeated spending slide. It's like watching a river slowly carve a canyon. You don't notice until the canyon exists." Emma nodded, feeling the truth of it. She thought about the psychological mechanisms at play: effortless spending, low perceived cost, habitual triggers, emotional compensation. They all conspired to make the drain invisible. But if one could intercept the flow with awareness, the outcome could shift dramatically. Even small adjustments, pausing for a conscious decision, consolidating subscriptions, creating a visible ledger, could redirect the current over time. That night, she returned home and tried a mental exercise. She visualized her money as a landscape. Her earnings were streams flowing into a reservoir labeled future potential. Each small, automatic purchase was a leak, a tiny crack in the dam she hadn't noticed. Some leaks were minor, others larger, but collectively, they had the power to reshape her reservoir over time. And the more she visualized it, the more she understood why tracking and awareness weren't just helpful. They were essential. Emma began experimenting with micro-decisions, treating them as experiments rather than restrictions. She asked herself before each small spend, is this a convenience, a comfort, or an unconscious habit? The answer often surprised her. Convenience could be justified, comfort could be reasonable, but unconscious habit required attention. Some habits she eliminated, others she replaced with conscious alternatives. A few evenings of scrolling apps became evenings of reading or journaling. A subscription she barely used became a donation to a cause she valued more. Slowly, she noticed subtle changes in her mindset. The urge to spend on small automatic conveniences didn't vanish. It diminished because she had added friction, visibility, and meaning to her decisions. The financial impact was tangible, yes, but the psychological impact was more profound. She felt more agency, more alignment between her money and her values, more connection to her choices. Each dollar became a conversation rather than a reflex. And yet, awareness alone wasn't enough. Emma realized the real power lay in patterns over time. The months of quiet tracking had shown her something important. Small habits compound just as powerfully as investments. One neglected $5 subscription might seem harmless, but multiply it over months, then years, and suddenly it was more than a coffee. It was a silent shaping of her life's possibilities. The difference between invisibility and visibility, passivity and awareness, was subtle, but it could define financial destiny. A week later, Emma sat with her ledger, writing out a month's worth of discretionary spending. This time, she annotated not just the amounts, but the triggers, the emotions, the context. She noticed recurring themes: evenings of boredom, minor anxieties, social media scrolling. The purchases weren't mindless, they were emotionally charged. She realized that many financial leaks mirrored emotional leaks, and just as she could repair one, she could repair the other by noticing, questioning, and redirecting. The lesson was quietly revolutionary. Money isn't just a tool, it's a reflection of mind. The invisible drains weren't evil, or even irrational. They were adaptive behaviors that had grown unchecked. Awareness didn't make them go away, but it reframed them. Every small spend became an opportunity to observe, to reflect, to choose differently. Emma felt lighter, more deliberate, more alive. And yet, she knew the challenge wasn't over. Awareness was the first step, but habits are stubborn. They thrive in invisibility. The quiet drains that had gone unnoticed for years could return if she let vigilance slip. She realized that life itself is filled with these subtle currents, small, repeated decisions that shape not only finances, but relationships, energy, and even personal growth. The question lingered: if one habit could quietly drain her bank account, what other invisible habits might be quietly shaping her life in ways she hadn't yet recognized? A few days later, Emma found herself wandering through a farmer's market. The air smelled of fresh bread and herbs, sunlight glinting off jars of honey. She stopped at a stand selling handmade soaps. The price was small, just a few dollars per bar, but she hesitated. She remembered the ledger, the months of small, unnoticed spending, the way invisible habits quietly drained her bank account. She picked up a bar, turned it over in her hands, and smiled. This time, the decision felt conscious. She understood why she was buying it: the texture, the fragrance, the small joy it would bring to her daily routine. It wasn't mindless. It wasn't invisible. It had intention. That small moment crystallized something she had been learning slowly. Money is a reflection of attention. Every dollar spent is a vote, a signal of what we value, whether we notice it or not. The subscriptions she had ignored, the automatic charges she hadn't questioned, were votes cast without her awareness. Over time, the accumulation of these invisible votes can define not just a bank balance, but a life. What she prioritized, how she felt, even how she experienced freedom. Emma thought about the compounding effect in a new light. It wasn't just about numbers. $100 saved per month didn't only become thousands in a bank account. It also reinforced a sense of control, of intentionality, of alignment between values and actions. Habits, she realized, were compound interest on behavior. Invisible drains eroded both wealth and self-trust. Visible, conscious decisions built both simultaneously. Later that evening, she sat in her chair, journal open. She traced her past months of spending, not just in numbers, but as stories. Each small, automated transaction was linked to a context, a feeling, a trigger. Some were excuses. It's convenient, I deserve it. Some were unconscious coping mechanisms. Scrolling through apps to soothe boredom, buying digital content to feel engaged. And others were genuine choices. A subscription she loved, a class she attended, a book she read. Seeing them side by side clarified the invisible pattern. Not all small spends were harmful, but the ones without awareness were quietly draining her energy, focus, and money. She wondered about the broader implications. Invisible drains weren't unique to her life. They were everywhere. Millions of people every day letting tiny automated choices shape months and years without reflection. Some paid little attention to the subscriptions, the micro-purchases, the minor conveniences that seemed harmless until summed over time. The psychological pattern was universal. Small, repeated, effortless gratifications often outcompete delayed, meaningful rewards, because our brains are wired to notice immediacy, not accumulation. Emma realized that the antidote wasn't austerity. It wasn't guilt. It was awareness, paired with curiosity. Understanding the triggers behind spending, tracking patterns, noticing the hidden emotional drivers. Each step required honesty, seeing the subtle compromises she made for comfort or distraction, questioning whether convenience justified the cost, and deciding consciously which habits to reinforce and which to release. One evening, she experimented with a small ritual she called financial mindfulness. Before any purchase, she paused, took a breath, and asked, "What does this transaction represent? Is it a vote for intention or invisibility?" Often the answer revealed hidden truths about her life. Anxiety she hadn't addressed, boredom she hadn't managed, values she hadn't articulated. She began to see her finances as more than numbers. They were mirrors reflecting her emotional and behavioral landscape. And the math behind it was subtle but persuasive. That $5 app, repeated 30 times a month, was $150. A minor cost in isolation, yet nearly $2,000 a year. That $10 small convenience, multiplied by months and years, became tens of thousands. Small, invisible drains compounded, not unlike interest, but in reverse. A slow erosion rather than growth. And the real cost wasn't just financial, it was the gradual undermining of confidence, clarity, and control. Emma noticed another effect. Awareness changed her emotional response. Where she once felt guilt after a small, untracked purchase, she now felt curiosity and insight. Each conscious decision, even one to spend, reinforced a sense of agency. Money wasn't a shadowy force acting upon her. It was a dialogue, a tool, a signal. Every dollar became a question. What do I choose to prioritize? By the end of the month, she tallied her discretionary spending in a new way. Not just total amounts, but patterns, triggers, emotional contexts. The act of noticing shifted the experience. A previous habit that had quietly drained her account no longer held that power. She felt a sense of liberation, subtle but profound, like sunlight finally reaching a corner of a room long ignored. Yet, even with this clarity, Emma understood a quiet truth. Life would always present invisible drains. They would appear in subtle habits, minor choices, fleeting impulses. Some would be financial, others emotional, and many both. The key wasn't perfection, it was vigilance and curiosity. Awareness could transform the quiet drain from a source of loss into a source of insight. The habits that once eroded her financial and emotional reserves could now serve as signals, guides, and opportunities for growth. As she closed her journal, she imagined a year from now, not a ledger of transactions alone, but a reflection of intentional living. Each small decision consciously made, each habit examined, each dollar accounted for, forming a pattern that supported her values rather than silently undermining them. She realized that the true wealth wasn't just in the money saved or invested. It was in the clarity, self-trust, and attention she cultivated along the way. And even as she savored this quiet sense of mastery, a lingering thought remained. If one subtle habit could quietly drain a bank account, what other invisible habits, small, repeated, seemingly harmless, might be quietly shaping her life, her choices, and her future without her noticing? Weeks turned into months, and Emma continued her quiet experiment. She didn't track every purchase obsessively, but she maintained awareness. She knew where her money flowed, why it flowed, and what habits fueled it. Some small pleasures remained. She still bought her occasional latte, subscribed to a few apps she genuinely enjoyed, but each decision had intention behind it. Money had become a conversation rather than a shadow she reacted to. One evening, she sat with Marcus at a park bench overlooking the city skyline. The air was cool, filled with the faint hum of distant traffic. Marcus asked almost casually, "Notice anything different lately?" Emma smiled. "I do. I see the choices I make, even the small ones. And I understand how they shape more than my bank account. They shape how I feel about myself, how I manage time, how I interact with the world. I used to let small things slip, and they quietly drained me. Now I notice." He nodded. "That's the trick. Awareness. Most people never see it coming. It's the tiny, repeated habits that slip through the cracks. One latte here, one app there. Individually, harmless. Collectively, invisible drains." Emma thought about the psychology behind it. How effortless, low-friction spending exploits natural cognitive biases. Our brains are wired to prioritize ease, comfort, and immediate gratification. Tiny payments bypass our conscious attention, eroding resources and subtly shaping behavior without ever sounding an alarm. The drain is quiet, almost polite, but over time, it is powerful. She thought about her own patterns, about the triggers she had uncovered: boredom, minor anxieties, social influence, habit loops. She realized that controlling these habits wasn't about willpower. It was about visibility, intentionality, and reflection. Once she could see the patterns, she could gently redirect them. Small changes compounded, just like money, just like behavior. Returning home that night, Emma sat with her ledger, flipping through months of entries. She didn't feel guilt anymore. She felt insight. Each line represented more than dollars. It represented choices, emotions, and attention. The invisible drains had lost their power simply because she had chosen to see them. She could trace their paths, understand their triggers, and intervene. She felt a quiet kind of empowerment, one that wasn't flashy but enduring. She reflected on the broader lesson. Wealth isn't built only by high income or big investments. It's quietly shaped day by the small, repeated decisions we make, decisions that often go unnoticed. Invisible habits dictate not only bank balances, but also freedom, confidence, and mental clarity. Awareness, curiosity, and intentionality can transform those same habits from drains into signals, guiding us toward the life we want rather than away from it. Emma leaned back and allowed herself a thought that once would have felt radical. Real wealth begins in attention. Every dollar, every choice, every tiny habit is a vote. And if you never notice where the votes go, they accumulate in ways you cannot control. But if you watch, reflect, and act, even quietly, you reclaim the power that has always been yours. She closed her ledger and picked up her coffee. Outside, the city buzzed, indifferent to individual choices. Yet in her small apartment, she,